So welcome everyone, my name is Miltin, I'm CEO of the African Cities Research Consortium, and thank you for coming to this interim presentation which shares where we're at. I'm going to start with an introduction to African cities. I'm going to try and give you a very small flavour of what we're finding, more to tempt you to keep track of the website. The final slide gives you details of that. Then I'm going to pass to Professor Shuaib Lwasa, who's going to talk a little bit about the work in Lagos. I'm going to make sure we have a full appreciation of the youth voice from Africa, with hopefully 4, but definitely 3 presentations from ACRC postdocs. We're then going to have a comment from Professor Victoria Beard, who's visiting from Cornell, and then we'll have lots of time, I think, for comments and questions from you all. So what is African Cities trying to do? African Cities responds to a challenge thrown at us by FCDO. And that challenge is, how can we be more effective, FCDO and the development world in general, in tackling complex problems in African cities? They are very conscious that the problems are huge, they're going to get bigger, and that although there absolutely have been successful efforts, they are not sufficient successful efforts. So that's the context in which we're working. As you see here, a few snapshots. 1 billion people, broadly 1 in 7 of the global population living in informal settlements worldwide. That's, of course, people living without adequate access to basic shelter. Some of them living in states of considerable insecurity, some of them living in states of slight insecurity, living without basic services, sanitation, water, etc. That is our challenge. Sub-Saharan Africa, 56% of the urban population is living under those conditions. Some in the cities, I'm going to be talking about the bigger cities, some in much smaller cities. The numbers already 500 million, predicted to be 666 million in just 7 years. So a daunting task for any local authority or national government. There has been much work recognising the potential within African cities, but a real acknowledgement that at all levels, wherever they're located, development professionals and academics have failed to address the challenge. So the programme that FCDO tasked us to do set us off working in 12 cities. These are the 12 cities. We originally had a 13th city, Khartoum. We stepped back from Khartoum primarily because FCDO gave us less money than we anticipated in this stage, but I think also because our initial explorations in that city highlighted some of the challenges around undertaking research and uptake work in that context, which was, even when we stepped back, already very violent and conflict-ridden. So I am not going to spend too much time on this. I think some of you will have seen it already, and others of you can easily catch up. But the conceptual framework, the pillars of African cities, are captured in this slide. So on the one hand, we start off working in studies in the first 12 cities. That is just what we're winding up now. And those studies have 2 pillars. One pillar is, how can we better understand the politics and the political economy of those cities? How can we understand the political opportunities and the political constraints in that context? So that's the first part of the puzzle that we're trying to look at. The second part is, how can we do that in a way which is sensitive to systems? Widely recognised that one of the core challenges, as I said, is the failure to address things like water and sanitation, systems like education and law and order. It's very hard to think about development prospects in that context. City systems are often very partial, often very fragmented, very fractured. How can we build on these 2 pillars? How can we understand the challenges of systems, the challenges of politics, and think about how they can be addressed. From the beginning, we recognised that thinking about those things simply across the city without getting, in a sense, our hands stuck into the materiality of cities would be very challenging. So we identified 8 domains that give us clues about how they can be understood. I'll come back to the domains. But the first stage, politically informed systems analysis and domain analysis, is where we are at the moment. We are transitioning into the next stage. I'll say a very brief word about that at the end of my part of the presentation. We're transitioning into the action research. So the idea, as I just said, break down politically informed systems analysis into a political analysis, a city of systems analysis, to better diagnose problems. For the political and political economy analysis, we're drawing particularly on a body of work developed by Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre, the work around political settlements, which tries to analyse how particular political economies and political interests land in deals. Those deals have significant implications for what happens at the national level. We are examining what is the relationship of that national politics to what plays out in the urban context, and indeed how well that conceptual framework fits when we're trying to understand city politics. The City of Systems work has developed studies of up to 10 systems in each of our 12 cities. So we are sitting with an incredible resource, probably between 100 and 120 system studies that give us insights into what is driving outcomes in those systems. We are working at the moment on using that material to help craft outputs which we hope will enable urban decision makers to better diagnose problems and ways to address those problems. The urban decision makers include, of course, FCDO and other bilateral, multilateral agencies, but we are optimistic that our findings will be relevant to national government agencies and city managers and other officials. So as I mentioned, and as all of you who work on urban will know, we couldn't simply think about the city scale. We wanted to get involved in work that is going on, in outcomes that are happening, in problems and challenges that are being experienced at the sub-city level. We have 8 domains that are crudely divided into the built environment, the economic and the social. I say crudely because we all know the complexities of dealing with those criteria, but we think these 8 domains help us to understand key challenges. So the built environment domains will work on housing, informal settlements, land on connectivity. The economic domains are on structural transformation, better paying, more skilled jobs, but also on neighbourhood and district economic development, the ways in which low-income people put together their livelihoods. The social domains are on youth and capability development, health, well-being and nutrition, and safety and security. And one of the treats for you of this presentation is that after you've listened to me and heard a bit about what's going on in one of our cities, you'll hear from 3, maybe 4, depending on technology, of our domains about the ways in which our research is helping advance an understanding in those domains. So as I started off a few minutes ago, the idea is that we really have a good understanding of some of the preconditions that help to drive change and transformation in African cities. We have the insights from our city analysis and the domain analysis, and we use those to go to the next level, the implementation phase, where we undertake action research projects that will test out our analytical abilities, will, I am sure, teach us far more about the ways in which new frameworks and existing frameworks can help drive an understanding about what makes change. Of course, we're trying to synthesize that knowledge into things that will be useful in other contexts. So I wanted just to touch, before coming to one of our action research projects, to give you a little bit of a flavour for what we're doing, I wanted to just touch on some of the things that we're finding. I think, of course, we know that politics and power make cities. There's nothing new in saying that. But in the 12 studies that we are working on and moving towards, I think there are 5 particular ways in which we can see that influence playing out. And they're all going to be critical for our action research projects. These are the lines of contestation, in a way, which they have to address to move forward. So the issues around wealth accumulation. I'll come on to illustrate that one. Also on income generation. For example, the project we're going to look at, the action research project from Harare, Glenview, which is a large informal market with about 400 furniture providers, has space barons. Call them space barons. Those are people who receive the money that the traders give them on a monthly basis. It doesn't go to the local authority or indeed the national ministry. The ways in which elites control elections. At one level, they control elections by offering projects and programs that address certain needs. Youth employment, a water tap, depending on the clientelist politics that's coming out. But they also do it by establishing territorial control, by moving people with violence on many occasions to strengthen their ability to control an electoral constituency and to advantage themselves and their positions of power. And finally, their illustrations of symbolic value, ways in which they demonstrate their capability, they represent their ideologies through grand road building programs, and they do ways in which they engage with and advance images of cities that offer them electoral success. So these are some of the things that we're teasing out as we move forward with our research. A couple of pictures that illustrate some of the things that I've just been speaking about. On the left-hand side, you have Nairobi tenements, in which, if you are rich enough to invest in one of these things, you can get your money back in 4 years. After that, you're basically earning income. Probably if you have one block, 10 floors, 10 to 14 rooms on each floor, so 140 households, you will be generating yourself an income broadly of $100,000 a year. Another example from the periphery of Nairobi, where roads have opened up new space. And of course, elites, in their efforts to create wealth and accumulate their own asset base, have been buying up land around the roads that are being developed. This is a familiar story, but it's a story that we need to engage with in order to strategize, find ways to strategize. Finally, a huge scale of public neglect, as I just touched on, the scale of informal settlements really highlights the challenges in this. I'm not going to go into this. We'll hear a little bit more about it. But of course, urban citizens are not passive in this process. They are constantly seeking ways to advantage their position. They're looking for ways in which they're trying to invest to be more secure and to offer opportunities for themselves and their families. So there are really a range of new efforts, new citizen efforts that you see as you move around the city. This is a picture from Accra, which is an attempt to upgrade shack settlements. In an informal settlement, someone who had some more money built rooms slightly higher quality for rental. This you can't really see, but this is someone who's charging batteries for you, car batteries, if you want to go watch TV or charge your mobile phones. And this is a group from Nairobi, the informal settlement of Mutare, where a citizen group have developed children's playgrounds, but they're having to constantly negotiate and hold on to this space. This is the challenge, the opportunity, the challenge, and the contestation. So before moving on to an introduction to what we're doing in Lagos, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavour of one of the pilot action research projects that we're doing. This is from Glenview. This is the project to upgrade a market, working with those trading and informally employed in the market. The market has about 400 plus sellers. People are really working in terrible conditions, very temporary shacks, very temporary roof coverings, no concrete pathways, and but there's a lot of customers. So at one level, they have opportunity, but they face problems. They face problems with fires and floods, and as I mentioned earlier, their payments are captured by space barons. The project that we're working with has the support both of the relevant ministry and the city of Harare, who are very keen to find ways to secure the income that people are paying to the space barons and to use that resource to upgrade the area. The project will strengthen traders' organisations. They exist already, but they're very defensive. They're small gains. Improve engagement with the city of Harare and the ministries, relevant ministries. Try and really co-produce upgrading. Improve regulatory frameworks. The context in Harare has really changed very significantly from being very hostile to informality to now recognising the significance of informality, and potentially replicate this project in other markets in the area. So hopefully I've given you a bit of a flavour for what we're doing. I'm now going to pass to Professor Shuaib Lwasa from some years ago, the University of Makerere, now at the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the work that's ongoing in Lagos.
Thank you very much, Diana. As mentioned by Diana, this is work in progress. And what the ACRC, in my opinion, has done is to spur further or catalyze the momentum amongst the academy in Nigeria in general, mainly from University of Lagos, but also the State University in Lagos. In addition, also some sort of collaboration with the University of Ibadan in Nigeria to work around the challenges in Lagos. And when we hear about Lagos, we know it has a massive city, no doubt about that, with so many challenges and complexities. It's not until you go underneath and start walking Lagos and you realize the potential. So the domains in this city that were studied include structural transformation, neighborhood and economic development, safety and security, and housing. And they have identified a number of opportunities from the domain research that could actually spur and catalyze the transformation in Lagos. So they've seized the opportunity around the recent elections in Nigeria, and Lagos in particular, to position the knowledge emerging so far, but also to start programming around co-production of knowledge that would inform the Lagos Strategic or State Development Plan, which is an old plan, but they look at it as one of the conveyors for the knowledge emerging, and the fact that a lot of what is in the plan also coincides with what is in the manifesto of the state governor, Olusola Sano-Olu, who is very much interested in addressing poverty in Lagos, as well as infrastructure transformation and development. But they're partnering with communities, of course, because of the massive nature of Lagos, as well as other partners, including the media. So these partnerships are emerging around this vision of a model megacity in Africa, a financial hub, and that is safe and secure, as well as functional and highly productive. And underneath that is the desire to reduce poverty or eradicate poverty through sustainable economic growth and infrastructure renewal and development. But of course, that is the vision. What is going on in reality and how even the eradication of poverty is conceptualized in the policy amongst the policy actors within Lagos might differ from what the emerging knowledge is actually telling us in respect to the potential. For example, the structural transformation domain did the analysis in Lagos, and it emerged that over 60% of employment and occupation, any form of employment, is categorized as other. So it's not in the formal mainstream economic employment sector, but rather informal or emerging or different ways that we can think about that. And with that, a number of what we call priority complex problems have been identified in each of this domain. One of it that I want to speak about very briefly is the household enterprises or HMEs. There is already a momentum in some ways in Lagos and in Nigeria, because there is the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Agency, which is at federal level, but also supports the state, but the University of Lagos has also a dedicated center on entrepreneurship skills development in Lagos. So working with partners to develop that. And one of the things they want to test out is how to financially include small and medium enterprises in Lagos across all different possibilities in terms of economic activity to catalyze transformation that is envisioned in the Lagos State Development Plan. The other priority complex problem they want to try is also to revamp the housing cooperatives in Lagos. It's a revamp because a good number of them do have land allocated. You could think of them as dormant, so they haven't been active in construction to increase the housing stock, but also make it affordable. And they want to also bring in the low carbon housing, the construction materials, and around that also build sort of a couple of value chains that would allow, again, small and medium enterprises in the construction materials within Lagos. The other domain that has identified work to do in a co-production manner is the safety and security, and they're approaching it. They want to approach it through different ways. I just pick one of them, which is vocationalization of education and eco-entrepreneurship to empower the marginalized youth. And as I said, Lagos is massive. It's a mega city. It also faces a lot of problems from migration from other parts of Nigeria, but also migration from nearby countries like Ghana and Togo and and that has been in some ways associated with the violence and security issues within Lagos, but at the same time, the research also identifies some possibilities in terms of opportunities. So this is just to give you a little bit of the emerging work in Lagos in terms of sparring partnerships and champions. The team thinks that with the recent elections and the appointment of commissioners in various positions, they're planning to engage with these commissioners together with the CDAs, the community development agencies, and councils that operate at sub-county level, and work with different academics and early career researchers, media, and advocacy to try and spur some of these innovations to drive that, so that the process drive itself. So one very specific example as I end, the University of Lagos has an FM radio station. So this is a medium or channel that they use to communicate information that is emerging out of this research and several other activities going on in the university, of course, to try and inform the public about what is emerging and what is possible. So there's this particular community in Shonki, which is on the lagoon front, that part of it was evicted violently through fires, and they created that momentum through the awareness. And now the community is remobilizing, supported by different actors, including the university through the Center for Housing and Sustainable Urban Development, again, UNILAG, together with other partners, of course. And they are trying to empower that community to try and reclaim that land, because the conditions under which they were evicted were a little bit flimsy. And that would allow then some of the ideas like the housing cooperatives to actually thrive, but also the emerging household enterprises within Lagos. So with that, I leave it here. It is work in progress, and hand back to Diana. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Shuaib. Okay, we're now going to pass to three postdocs. Okay, we'll try the fourth one. Please, Ezana Walde Gabriel. We have three, four. Yeah, come. So, we're going to hear, oops, dismiss. We're now going to, why is it not moving on? Okay, we're now going to move. Ezana, away with you. Okay, now we're going to hear a little bit about some of the findings within domains, but we're going to start, Ezana, with work on reform coalitions.
Thank you very much. I'll talk you through a bit about reform coalitions, and then my colleagues would add on that from their findings from the respective domain studies. So when we start about reform coalition, I want to start from the theory of change of African Cities Research Consortium. African Cities Research Consortium understands that urban reform, urban change, or urban transformation is predicated upon these 4 pillars. That is political commitment, the elite's commitment, towards long-term change, not immediate, vote buying mechanisms, but something substantive change which have long-term impact. State capacity, increase the state capacity, not only understood as resource capacity or expertise, but also including, particularly in the urban context, the ability of planners, professionals, the ability to work with communities or to do part of the research or to collaborate with communities and other stakeholders and organized and mobilized communities, which is important because in urban areas, people are usually, the majority urban poor are disenfranchised. So they get their power from collection, from mobilization. And the other most important pillar is formal and informal reform coalitions. This one is not, it might not be always a necessary condition, but it's a very key ingredient to catalyze reforms, change in urban areas in terms of changing how things are done, in terms of bringing reforms and system change. Reform coalitions are important, but this is predicated on, depending on the context and depending on the issues that are being tackled, or depending on the type of the reform. So the way we understood reform coalitions in ACRC is it's a group of different stakeholders. It might be civil society groups, state agencies, private enterprises, or organized community members. They come together to effect a certain change. They might have, a short or long period. It depends. Some coalitions can have a very enduring time horizon. Some might be, short-term focused. But one thing that makes them different is that they have a strong relations to effect change, and they come together, for a specific topic or for a specific agenda or reform agenda, but while maintaining their individual organizational autonomy. They don't lose their individual autonomy. And one more thing that I want to emphasize here is that it shouldn't necessarily be these coalitions, a collaboration. Sometimes it might happen among state agencies. Sometimes in most African cities, I can name my hometown as an example. Even the government works in a different and in a less organized and less integrated way. And sometimes state agencies or state actors, they come together, they collaborate to effect change. So these reform coalitions also can happen within the state. And it shouldn't necessarily involve organized communities, but when it does, it would have a more inclusive output. And some of the reasons that we're much more interested in reform coalitions here in ACRC is, first, it has the benefit of challenging exclusion and adverse incorporation of the disadvantaged groups. This is because it gives particularly the disenfranchised groups or the disadvantaged groups to form solidarities, to form relations or build relational capital with powerful groups such as academics, state agencies, or NGOs or civil society groups to effect change. So one of its advantages that we are interested in is its ability to challenge the power asymmetry that disadvantaged groups face. It also helps to build capacities, in the sense that when disadvantaged groups establish relations with, for example, academicians, they might help them to build their capacity to do research, to do community research. They will help them, to legitimize or authenticate the findings that the community identify or generate, and help them to present to the to authorities, or in a way that's legible to authorities. A good example would be, the platform established by Shuaib in Kampala, the Urban Action Lab, and also do innovative.
No, me just letting in Elizabeth.
Okay, and also innovation. It gives disadvantaged groups to innovate, to experiment, because different solutions are context specific, and when disadvantaged groups build relations with different actors, it will get them to test out urban solutions, not only identifying problems, but also solutions. And finally, it also helps to capitalize on political opportunities and building solidarities to challenge political threats. Sometimes government might come up with political reform, or there might be an election. So when disadvantaged groups build relations with powerful groups, they could use that opportunity, opportunity of legal reform or election and so on, to advance the needs or the demands of the low-income groups or groups which are otherwise excluded or adversely incorporated. And also having relations with state agencies and powerful groups also might help to protect disadvantaged groups from adverse impacts or adverse repercussions of asserting your rights in the urban context. But not everything would happen, within the framework of that reform coalition. To be able to capitalize on political opportunities and threats, sometimes you need to also go beyond that coalition framework and then engage in other forms of resistance to be able to challenge or to be able to be heard. So these are the things. If you want further ask me these issues, we can get back to it during Q&A.
Okay, you have to pass on, no?
Okay.
Jack in the box.
Elizabeth, can you hear us?
She's not on right now,
We'll
so
come
shall
back.
we? The next
We'll
one.
come back
Okay.
to Elizabeth.
I would invite my colleague, Dr. Patience Azande. Dr. Patience.
Thank you very much. So the safety and security domain, we had our research in 6 of the 12 cities that the ACRC covered. We had research in Lagos, Maiduguri, Freetown, Mogadishu, Bukavu, and in Nairobi. And we had quite a lot of important and interesting findings. But in the context of today's discussion, I'm just highlighting just a few to talk about how they help us think about reform on safety and security in African cities. Now, the first point is that we found that across the 6 cities that we studied, there were varied notions of what constitutes insecurity. But the problem here is that when the state thinks about reforms on safety and security, they think about institutions and not what is driving insecurity or what constitutes insecurity. So for instance, when you have a reform project that targets upgrading informal settlements, you're in a way dealing with insecurity, directly or indirectly, different forms of insecurity targeted through that singular reform of upgrading informal settlements. Also, when you have a youth empowerment program, for instance, you're directly or indirectly dealing with some form of security issues that are affecting African cities. But when the state or other people who advocate for reforms think about safety and security, they think about crime. So what our research is trying to say is that beyond crime, there are other forms of insecurity that are dominant in African cities. The second point is the perceived weakness or failure of the state. This is not new. But one thing that the cities we covered had in common was that most of them are currently experiencing conflict or coming out of conflict. And so in these states, in these cities, the presence of the state is quite weak. And so we see a proliferation of non-state actors who are involved in security provision. And now here is the challenge. These non-state actors are outside of the legal frameworks. They are not recognized by the law. And how is this going to affect reform? Again, when the state thinks about reforming security, it thinks about institutions. And the state institution that is responsible for addressing crime is the police. So most of the reforms in African cities are targeted at reforming the police force. And across our cities, we found that there were different results that had come out. In Nairobi, for instance, our researcher there reported that the police reforms have produced very little or no results at all. And in Nigeria, also in Maiduguri, in Lagos, Nigeria has a federal police, so the reforms have yielded little or no results. And so we find across the cities that we studied that there were divided opinions about whether or not to abolish the police, which is one extreme, and then on the other hand, whether to introduce more reforms. So how will this pan out eventually? And then where, like I said, in many of the cities, the non-state actors or the informal security providers seem to be more popular than the state police, but they are not recognized by law. And so how do you bring together, form a coalition that tries to bring together the state police and the non-state actors in ways that address the safety and security issues that are being experienced in these cities? Then finally, we found some what I call platforms that exist in these cities. For instance, the Social Justice Center in Nairobi, the Drug Control Committees in Maiduguri, and then the Police Community Relations Committee, also in Maiduguri. These platforms facilitate learning, dialogue, and co-production. But can we really refer to them as reform coalitions, or do they have potential to catalyze reform on safety and security in these cities? So these are some of the things we found in the safety and security domain that are helping us to think about how reforms can be catalyzed to improve safety and security in African cities. Thank you.
You have to pass to Smith.
Okay. So next is Dr. Smith Omar, who will speak on informal settlements.
Thank you. So very quickly take us through some of the findings that are emerging from the informal settlements domain, which is also one of the domains that we were working on. And our domain focused on 7 cities. I will not look at the findings, but I'll quickly, very quickly enumerate them, because the focus today will be on how citizens and citizens groups are seizing the opportunities within their cities and driving reforms within these informal settlements contexts. So our findings in the informal settlements domain revolve around typologies, how informal settlements are understood across the different cities. We also have findings that speak to how informal settlements are governed. So the power and governance dynamics within the different informal settlements in the different cities that we are looking at. Then we're also looking at how city systems play out within these informal settlements contexts, how water is accessed, for instance, how services like education are accessed within these informal settlements context, and how politics informs how residents are able to access these different services. But we also looked at the emerging policy interventions that are being formulated in the different cities. So we're not just focusing on the problematics, but we're also trying to look at what kinds of interventions are being put in place to drive these different reforms to these pressing problems that were identified in these different cities. So we also try to look at how residents are seizing the opportunities. And this speaks to one of the points that Ezana mentioned, how mobilized citizens are pushing for change within their different contexts. And within the informal settlements domain, we realize that there are different modalities of collective actions or different modalities of collective actions that residents are employing. And this is based on the fact that residents also constitutes a group that wield power within this informal settlements contexts, and they've been able to understand that through this power they can drive reform, they can drive for push for certain interventions in a local context and also at a city context, and also drive policy changes at a wider scale. So residents either individually or collectively have mobilized around different issues. So in cities like Harare, we have this forum that is the Urban Informality Forum that is primarily driven by Dialogue on Shelter and the Zimbabwe's Homeless People's Federation, that brings together different stakeholders to discuss different issues and to try to propose interventions to the issues affecting the informal settlements in Zimbabwe, in Harare. We also have examples, and we also have examples in cities like Kampala, like the Urban Action Lab, which Shuaib was part of. And these are also forums that residents in Kampala have come together, engage with relevant governmental stakeholders to try to drive change within the context of Kampala. In Nairobi also, there's an initiative, an ongoing initiative in one of the informal settlements that was mentioned by Diana, that is Madare Informal Settlement. So the initiative, the Madare Special Planning Area, which is currently bringing on board different stakeholders together with residents to try to get this settlement to be declared as a special planning area, and which will hence trigger interventions by the county government of Nairobi. This follows from an example, an experience in a different informal settlement in Nairobi called the Mukuru Informal Settlement, where residents collectively came together with other NGOs and together with other civil society organizations and state actors of the Nairobi County government, and they drove this planning process for this informal settlement that had previously not been planned for before. And from this experience, there's certain interventions in the form of hospitals that have been constructed in this informal settlement, in terms of sanitation, in terms of roads that have now been established within this informal settlement. So these are initiatives that residents have used to drive change and to engage with relevant local authorities to bring in these kinds of interventions. But there's still challenges that we see within these spaces that residents are trying to create to drive change. First of all, whenever residents and non-governmental organizations come together, we see a retreat of the state stepping back, because these groups are now carrying forward these different interventions. So this challenge of the government or the state retreating from this space is very present whenever these urban reform coalitions are created. So it's sort of an abdication of responsibility by the state, or leaving NGOs and civil society organizations to drive this change that primarily should be driven by the state. And then we also have the challenge of how to integrate the knowledge of local communities within these spaces, because a majority of these spaces will be constituted by civil society organizations and NGOs which are primarily composed of middle-class inhabitants of the cities who do not necessarily reside in these informal settlements. So with this, there's a displacement of the voices of beneficiary groups or residents of these informal settlements. So how do we integrate the knowledge of beneficiary groups, the knowledge of local residents within these spaces in a meaningful way so that the spaces are not taken over by these external experts? So these are some of the challenges that are emerging within the informal settlements context, particularly with regards to these reform coalitions or these spaces for reform that residents are trying to create. I'll hand it over to Diana for conclusion. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to just try and see if we can get one more contribution from Dr. Elizabeth Desai.
So thank you for this opportunity to present the youth and capability development domain findings, which are very exciting. I'll try to squeeze it in 2 minutes like my colleagues did, I think. So if you're looking at the slide that I put together, so the first point refers to some of the key finding that really cut across all of our cities, or maybe I should mention which cities these are. So our domain conducted research in Freetown, Maiduguri, Mogadishu, Kampala, and Addis Ababa. So what we found throughout those cities is that experiences of youth differ depending on intersecting social indicators. So it was very difficult to sort of pinpoint specific findings in relation to youth as one category, because obviously that wouldn't be possible. So although what was interesting is that this overarching theme related to unemployment and underemployment really was profound in all those cities. And so in relation to differences to access to education, finance, healthcare, law and order, these were the key systems that were identified in our domain. And what was interesting in cities like Freetown and Maiduguri, for example, but in Mogadishu as well, is that young girls and women were particularly disenfranchised when it came to access to education, finance, and healthcare. Also in relation to law and order, because they were much more prone to experiencing gender-based violence. Let me move on to the second point. So in relation to the politics of youth, since the youth question was really pronounced also in cities like Freetown, where what research there really highlighted was that young people are often used as pawns before elections, but once elections fade and the excitement from election outcomes fade, youth are sort of, one of the terms that was used was dropped like hot potatoes. So suddenly it becomes very clear that elite commitment to addressing the youth question, specifically in relation to unemployment and access to services, was not necessarily sincere. And so this was particularly pronounced, and also in relation to women's representation in politics. This was also pronounced in Mogadishu and Maiduguri, as well as in Kampala, although in Kampala, the politics of youth in Kampala, which is a city with a lot of IDPs, and many of those IDPs are young people as well. This was also very, very specific. So, and then the third point, so in relation to urban reforms, what's really interesting is that young people, since they are overrepresented demographically, cities, African cities are, of course, composed of young people mainly. What's interesting is that our research didn't necessarily frame urban reform initiatives explicitly, but then I think that might not necessarily be because they are not present, because youth mobilize at the level of informal settlements. Women are central to such mobilization. So I think that in relation to urban reform initiatives, it has more to do with really sort of going into that research and framing what these initiatives are from the beginning, and then I think we would have been able to identify them much more clearly. Although this is my own reading, I'm not representing the domain leads when I say this, but since I'm now working on the ACRC's database, I think it's quite clear that many reform initiatives relate to youth and speak to youth directly. So, and also with my 10 seconds left, hopefully I can also say that the ACRC database of urban reform initiatives will be launching very soon, so watch this space. Thank you.
So thank you, Hannah. Hannah Boylan, who is our communications officer and a very loyal supporter who rises to the occasion, as you see. So before we open up to comments and questions, we're going to hear from Professor Victoria Beard from Cornell University. Professor Beard heads up the WeHo Centre for Cities at Cornell, so lots of experience on the kinds of issues that we've talked about here. But I first knew Victoria and she was heading up the World Resources Institute's effort to contribute knowledge to equitable and sustainable cities. And I learned an immense amount through my involvement in that program. So over to you.
Thank you. You're so kind. Good afternoon. I'm going to have to read from my notes because I don't know this project as well as all the other presenters. But first, I want just to everyone in the room just to really acknowledge all the work and commend this project. I find this project very hard to comment on because it's so ambitious and it's so brave in the way that it embraces complexity that I can't think of. Honestly, I was sort of writing up some pre-comments this morning and I couldn't think of another project in the world that is so ambitious and just so open to all of this kind of complexity. So yay to the team. Also, I was saying to Diana last night, actually, I know from my work at WRR, on the World Resources Report at WRI, that these projects, they take on their own logic, they take on their own vocabulary, and so it is, and I know that there's a lot of deep thought and discussion that goes into all of the different decisions that are made, so I say, take my comments with a big grain of salt. But I did, so I've read one of the domain reports and I've been participating in the advisory meetings. It was really good to come here and get to meet people in person and really understand more deeply how the project's organized. And one thing that I watched a couple of times was Diana's presentation of the theory of change, that sort of 10-minute video. If you haven't watched it, and I don't know how familiar everyone is with the project, that was very helpful for me in sort of like wrapping my mind around this. So I've organized my comments into theoretical, empirical, analysis. I have a technical point. I'll say something quickly about communications, and then next steps. And so that's kind of my outline. So I only have one really big theoretical comment. And in terms of thinking about your theory of change, I feel that the literature on collective action, and Smith sort of alluded to this a bit, would actually be really beneficial here. I feel that you have been very brave in terms of how you have faced the complexity of urbanization and urban transformation. But I feel that when I read the domain reports and when I'm sort of studying the material, that the way that Elinor Ostrom in particular articulates the relationship between some of these variables that you are also looking at would be really helpful. So I actually this morning went through this literature again and was kind of making sure that I was remembering it correctly. And I want to say one thing about Elinor Ostrom's work. Many of us know her from Governing the Commons, and we think, oh, she's doing this research on collective action, looking at the management of natural resources. But if you go back to the beginning of her career in the 1960s, she started looking at systems of water utilities and also the distribution of safety services, police services in cities. She began her research in cities, and so that's when she came up with the concept of polycentric, which she then engaged at the end of her life when she was thinking about climate change and transformation across scales. So I do think this literature would be very relevant to you. I have one article in particular that I was looking at today that I think might be helpful, Beyond Markets and States, Polycentric Governance of Complex Economic Systems, 2010 American Economic Review, because that's where she kind of reviews this whole evolution, and it will give you a guide to where you need to go, because it's a huge literature, right? Okay, so I have 4 empirical points, and one of these just came up listening to the presentations. So in terms of the sort of the 4 elements that you have, I'm going to forget your name, Ansan? Izan, presented on. When I look at those, I agree with all of them, but I guess I want to push you further to ask, are those, and you sort of, I think, alluded to this, like sometimes some are present, sometimes some, are they weighted the same? Are they all necessary? Are they all sufficient? What if one was missing? What if one's coming and going? And so I sort of wanted to push you beyond that to kind of tell me more, right? So that's one of my empirical points. I also wanted to push sort of the team or the project to think about, because I think everybody in this room that understands how urban transformation happens, we would all agree it never happens linear. It never sort of takes off and goes and keeps going, right? So it's always going to stall. It's always going to be one step forward, two steps back. And so I wanted to sort of push this group to think about when that happens. So when it takes off and when we feel like even it's going in a good direction, things are all pointing in a positive way, what happens when it gets off track, and what does it take to get it back on track? And then I want to push you even further, and these things are all easier said than done. So when you have urban reform and you sort of say, okay, this is going well, it's been going well for a little while, what does institutionalizing that urban reform look like? How does this happen? And what does it take to maintain that institutionalization of positive urban reform over time, I guess was sort of my question there. And my last sort of empirical point, when I look at this and I look at the theory of change, and it's so, you know, for lack of a better term, it's so complete and it's so rigorous and it does embrace this complexity. I look at it and I wonder, what are the backroom conversations about what you all decided to leave out and why? I think there were probably some strategic decisions about things that you left out and why. Okay, so analysis. So this kind of comes out of my conversations with Diana. She goes, you know, we're at this point, maybe it's similar to what I was feeling with the WRR. We did, you know, 8 sectoral papers, we did 8 city level case studies, and then we had all this material, we've done all this work, and it's sort of overwhelming to be in that position when you've done all of this work. And so I will say this, honestly, I don't think we took the time and mental and intellectual space that we should have to analyze that work, to get all the benefit out of it. So I was reflecting back on this and thinking, what would I do differently if I was still at WRI in DC and I had some time and space to reflect on this and get as much out of it? For me, I would do at least one workshop, if not a series of workshops, and I would get all of the people in the room that have been working on this, and in very, very simple terms, I would use timelines, matrices, process tracing, and spatial analysis, very simple methodologies to get people to go through the relationships between the variables in your theory of change. I just feel that we don't spend enough, because I want to make a point. I feel like a lot of times the learning that's happened through this process is in the human beings that actually do the work. And even when you write working papers, you can't really capture all of that learning. So like I get a sense when you're up here and you're stuck to 10 minutes, there is a lifetime of knowledge and learning that's happened by your participation in this process. And so it's very tricky. How do you bring that out and get as much out of it as you can? Okay, I have a technical point, which is sort of thinking about like where the project's going in the next phase. And I guess that's just, I would encourage you, as difficult as it is, to articulate how you've done your theory of change in this phase of the project, to think about KPIs. And I realize these key performance indicators are very much kind of development terminology, but it's like basically how are you going to defend that you know what you know? So when you start to tell us how urban transformation is happening and you're concluding this next phase of your project, you say, oh, we learned all this stuff in phase 1, we did implementation in phase 2, and all these positive things happen. How are you going to measure that? Now, I know that you're going to say back to me, well, the data at the city level is so problematic, it's so incomplete, but I would really press you to think about that both quantitatively and qualitatively, and I bet that if your team does this, you will come up with very creative ways to measure this and evaluate it that are compelling. So I just would push you to think now about your KPIs as you enter into the implementation. Now I know that this is probably maybe not so important, this little bit, I have to say it, I can't control myself about communications because I'm obsessed with this. I think communications is super important. I sort of feel, I constantly think about that old metaphor, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it actually make a sound? Because I feel that probably I spent 15 to 20 years of my life writing journal articles that nobody reads. And so, okay, 3 people read them, and one of them is my mother, I tell people. So I think communications is super, super important, and I think you need to press yourself to think about this all the time. And so I try to articulate how I think about it. Who does this work need to influence, and who does this work serve? I think you have to constantly add, and then how do you package this work for those different audiences. Because what you want probably here is a campaign, right? So you've done all of this work and you're going to do this implementation. And this is huge, and you want to bring a large group of diverse stakeholders along with you. And so, how do you package this so all of that learning can be digested and used by those different audiences? So you're doing some of that. Like, I'm so inspired to see this cohort of postdocs, and I've been listening to the podcast, and then I was excited to hear Shuaib talk about this FM radio in Lagos. And so you're already doing some of it, but you have to keep pushing about these different ways of packaging it. I'm coming to the end here. So next steps. So this is kind of a challenge and a provocation, and it's somewhat self-serving. This is an amazing project. And there seems to be several actors, to my knowledge, buzzing around the periphery of the space, including myself. Like, we're kind of buzzing around, interested and inspired by all this work that's going on. So Erasmus University is one, WRI is one, Cornell's one, and UN Habitat. I mean, big actors that are historically been very important in this space. So I would push this team to think about, with your commitment to co-production and this privileged position that you now occupy, how do you engage this larger group? Because if you are going to do a campaign, you are going to, you're in a very privileged position to lead this, to tell people the direction to move in, tell people the direction they shouldn't be moving in. It's a waste of time. And so how are you going to organize with these other actors buzzing around this space? Anyway, it's been an honor and a pleasure to watch this project evolve from the periphery. And I just congratulate all of you. It's huge what you've already done. Thank you.